Think about the last few years of your life. How many times have you heard someone describe their ex as a narcissist? Their boss, their mother, their best friend from college who stopped texting back. At some point, and you probably noticed this too, the word just exploded. Everyone has a narcissist in their story now. Everyone survived one. Everyone is healing from one. And here's the thing, some of them absolutely did. Narcissistic abuse is real. The damage it causes is real. And for people who genuinely experienced it, finally having language for what happened to them was life-changing. But something else is also happening. Something quieter. Something worth talking about. Because when every difficult person in your life becomes a narcissist, the word stops meaning anything. And when the word stops meaning anything, the people who actually need it lose something important. So today we're going to talk about what narcissism actually is, how the word got away from us, and what it means for your relationships when armchair diagnosis becomes the default way we handle conflict. Let's start with the actual psychology, because most people who use this word have never looked at what it clinically means. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD, is a genuine psychiatric diagnosis. It appears in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual used by mental health professionals worldwide. It's characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a deep need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy. Not occasionally, not when stressed, but consistently across every area of life. Here's what makes it clinically significant. It's egocentric. That means the person with NPD doesn't experience their behavior as a problem. They don't lie awake at night wondering if they hurt you. They genuinely believe the world revolves around them, and that belief feels completely natural to them. Estimates suggest that between 0.5 and 5% of the general population meets the criteria for NPD. Some researchers put it even lower. Now think about that number, and then think about how many people in your social circle have been labeled a narcissist in the last 2 years. The math doesn't add up, which means one of two things is true. Either we are dramatically underestimating how common NPD actually is, or we are dramatically overusing the word. The research points pretty clearly toward the second option. So how did we get here? It started in legitimate places. Researchers like Dr. Craig Malkin and authors like Dr. Ramani Durvasula did genuinely important work bringing narcissistic abuse into public awareness. For survivors of truly narcissistic relationships, people who had been gaslit, manipulated, and systematically made to doubt their own reality, this work was a lifeline. And then the internet did what the internet always does. It took a clinical concept, specific, nuanced, carefully defined, and flattened it into content, into a checklist, into a personality type you could identify in a 10-minute YouTube video. Suddenly, narcissist didn't mean someone who met the clinical criteria for NPD. It meant anyone who made you feel bad, anyone who was selfish sometimes, anyone who didn't apologize the way you needed them to, anyone who prioritized their own needs in a way that felt inconvenient to you. And on social media, where content that validates your pain performs better than content that complicates it, this version of the word spread fast. Videos with titles like 10 Signs You're Dealing with a Narcissist would rack up millions of views, because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. And when you're hurting in a relationship, the idea that the other person has a diagnosable disorder is deeply appealing. It gives your pain a name. It gives you a clean narrative. It puts all the responsibility on one side. The problem is, real relationships are almost never that clean. Here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Most of the behaviors people point to when they call someone a narcissist, the selfishness, the defensiveness, the difficulty taking accountability, the tendency to make everything about themselves. These behaviors exist on a spectrum, and most of them have explanations that have nothing to do with personality disorder. Attachment theory gives us a much more useful framework. Someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away when you need closeness. Someone with an anxious attachment style overwhelms you with need. Neither of these is narcissism. Both of these can feel like narcissism when you're on the receiving end. Unprocessed trauma creates defensive self-centeredness. People who grew up in environments where their needs were never met learn to fight hard for themselves. sometimes at the expense of the people around them. That's not a personality disorder. That's an adaptation. Emotional immaturity looks like selfishness. People who never develop the tools for empathy and accountability, not because they lack the capacity, but because no one ever modeled it for them, will frustrate you endlessly. But frustrating someone is not the same as having NPD. Even plain old stress makes people worse. Under pressure, most of us become more self-focused, less patient, less able to hold space for someone else's needs. Under enough sustained stress, people can look remarkably narcissistic, temporarily. None of this makes their behavior okay. None of this means you have to stay. But it does change the story. And the story you tell about what happened to you matters, because it shapes what you do next. So what actually happens when we overapply this label? First, it ends conversations that might have been worth having. The moment you've decided someone is a narcissist, you've also decided they're not capable of change. You've decided the relationship is unsalvageable. You've decided there's nothing to work through, only something to escape from. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes leaving is exactly the right thing and no conversation would help. But sometimes, more often than the content would have you believe, the person on the other side of that diagnosis is just a flawed human being who hurt you in ways they may not fully understand. And flawed human beings who hurt people they care about are sometimes capable of doing better, when someone tells them clearly what the problem is, when they have real motivation to change, when the relationship has enough foundation to rebuild on. Labeling them a narcissist removes that possibility before it's been tested. Second, it can keep you stuck. There's a version of healing that looks productive from the outside, but is actually a way of not moving. Reading endlessly about narcissistic abuse, watching video after video confirming your experience, building an increasingly detailed case for why the other person was the problem. Psychologists call this rumination. And while processing what happened to you is genuinely necessary, ruminating about it, replaying it, sharpening the narrative, that can become its own trap. Because at some point, healing requires turning your attention away from what was done to you and toward who you want to become. Third, and this is the one nobody wants to hear, sometimes the label is a way of avoiding a harder question. What was my part in this? Not in the abuse, if there was real abuse, but in the dynamic, in what you tolerated, in what you participated in the patterns you brought to the relationship from everything that came before it. Narcissist is a word that puts all the weight on one side of the scale. And sometimes that's accurate, but sometimes it's comfortable. And comfort and honesty are not always the same thing. None of this is an argument for staying in relationships that damage you. If someone in your life consistently manipulates you, gaslights you, makes you feel crazy for having normal human needs, trust that experience. You don't need a clinical diagnosis to know that a relationship is harming you. You don't need to prove they have a personality disorder to justify protecting yourself. But there's a difference between protecting yourself and building a story that makes you permanently the victim and everyone who ever hurt you permanently the villain. Real healing, the kind that actually changes your life, usually requires more nuance than that. It requires sitting with the uncomfortable possibility that most people who hurt you were just people, struggling people, defensive people, hurt people who hadn't figured out how not to hurt others. That doesn't make what they did okay. It just makes them human, and it makes you someone who can move forward, not just away. The word narcissist is not going away, but maybe the next time you reach for it, you can pause for just a second and ask yourself whether the word is helping you understand something or helping you avoid something. That 1 second might change more than you expect.